A quiet hunter, his heart a hollow of old grief, bought a silent girl, her spirit bound by shame and a stepmother's cruel coin, then discovered the silence was a shield, not a lock. The dust of the raw-boned town, aptly named Purgatory Flat, swirled in a gritty haze, coating everything with a film of desolation. It clung to the sweat-slicked faces of the jeering men, to the sagging porch of the mercantile where Martha, Ilara's stepmother, stood with a cruel smirk playing on her thin lips. Ilara stood on a rickety auction block, a burlap sack tied loosely over what had once been a passable dress, now torn and stained. Her head was bowed, a curtain of matted, straw-colored hair hiding her face, but the tremors that shook her slender frame were visible to all. The crowd was a motley assortment, leering drifters, hard-faced farmers looking for cheap labor, a few scornful townswomen clutching their shawls tighter as if proximity to Ilara might infect them. Martha's voice, sharp and grating as a rusty hinge, cut through the murmurs. "Prime goods, this one. Young, strong enough for field work or other chores. And quiet. Deaf as a post, won't give you no lip, no sass. $10, who'll start at 10 for this useful creature?" A raw laugh erupted from a burly man with a stained beard. "Deaf, you say? Might be a blessin' at that. $5, Martha, and that's being a generous for damaged goods." Ilara flinched as if struck, though no hand had touched her. Damaged. The word echoed in the silent chamber of her mind, a pronouncement she had lived with for years. Her deafness, they called it. A convenient excuse for their cruelty, a label that stripped her of her humanity. She wasn't deaf, not entirely. Sounds reached her, muted and distorted as if traveling through thick water, but words, if spoken clearly and close, could sometimes be parsed. But to admit this was to invite a different kind of torment, the kind that sought to break what it could not understand. Silence had become her refuge, her armor. Caleb watched from the edge of the sparse crowd, leaning against a sun-bleached support post of the smithy, his face shadowed by the brim of his worn hat. He was a tall man, built lean and hard like the mountain winters he endured. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He had come to Purgatory Flat for supplies, salt, flour, bullets, not for human chattel. The spectacle turned his stomach, the casual cruelty of it a familiar ache in his chest, a reminder of other losses, other brutalities the world so readily dispensed. He knew Martha, a sour, grasping woman whose husband had drunk himself into an early grave, leaving her with a stepdaughter she clearly despised. He'd seen Ilara before, a fleeting shadow in the town, always flinching, always silent. He'd assumed, like everyone else, that the girl was truly deaf. The bidding was sluggish, demeaning. Martha's price dropped. 7, then. A bargain for a strong back. She don't eat much, like a bird. The burly man scoffed. 4, and I'll take her off your hands. Caleb pushed himself off the post. His movement, though quiet, drew a few eyes. He didn't speak, just walked through the parting onlookers until he stood before the auction block. He looked not at Martha but at the trembling girl. He saw the fine bones beneath the grime, the way her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. He saw not a damaged goods, but a trapped animal. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a voice seldom used. 20th. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Martha's eyes widened, then narrowed with avarice. $20 from Mr. Caleb Thorne. A man of taste. Do I hear 25? The burly man spat in the dust, muttering curses. No one else spoke. The sum was outlandish for such a girl, especially from a recluse like Thorne, a man who kept to himself in the high wilderness and was rumored to be touched by sorrow, or perhaps madness. Sold! Martha cried, slamming a grubby hand on the block. To Mr. Thorne, for $20 silver. Caleb ignored her, his gaze fixed on Ilara. He stepped forward, pulling a worn leather pouch from his belt and counting out the coins into Martha's eager, claw-like hand. The metallic clink seemed to sever the last tie binding Ilara to this place. Martha, pocketing the money, roughly untied the rope that bound Ilara's wrists to a post behind her. She's all yours, Thorne. Mind you, no refunds. Caleb didn't acknowledge her. He simply gestured with his head towards the far end of the street where his pack mule, laden with his meager supplies, waited patiently. He said nothing to Ilara, offered no word of comfort or explanation. He merely started walking, expecting her to follow. Ilara, her wrists raw, stumbled down from the block, her legs unsteady. The eyes of the crowd burned into her back, a mixture of shock, pity, and derision. She risked a glance at the man, Thorn. His back was to her, broad and unyielding. He hadn't even looked at her face. What manner of man paid such a price for a deaf, useless girl? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had enveloped her. Was this a worse fate? She had no choice. She gathered the tattered remnants of her dignity, tightened the burlap over her thin shoulders, and followed the silent hunter out of Purgatory Flat, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, a life of whispered cruelties and loud condemnations, stepping into an unknown, vast, and terrifying silence. The sun beat down, and the dust rose with each step, coating her bare feet, already sore. The hunter set a steady pace, not fast, but relentless, uphill, away from the stench of the town and towards the distant, hazy blue of the mountains that loomed like sleeping giants. He didn't look back. She wondered if he knew she was there, or if he even cared. Each footfall was a question, each gust of wind a sigh of uncertainty. The silence between them was as vast and unforgiving as the landscape they traversed. The journey to Caleb's cabin was a blur of aching muscles and parched throat for Ilara. He moved through the rugged terrain with an economy of motion she could only marvel at, while she stumbled over loose rocks and tangled roots, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He stopped twice, once by a clear, fast-running creek where he drank deeply, then motioned for her to do the same. The water was icy cold, shocking her system, but it soothed the fire in her throat. He offered her a piece of dried meat from his bag. It was tough and salty, but it was the first food she'd had all day, and she ate it slowly, feeling a measure of strength return. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She tried to glean something from his eyes, a hint of his intentions, but they were like polished stones, reflecting nothing but the wilderness around them. The second stop was as dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the western sky. He made a small, smokeless fire with practiced ease, the scent of pine and dry earth mingling with the cool evening air. He shared more jerky and a hard biscuit. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the distant call of a night bird. She huddled near the fire, pulling the thin burlap tighter, exhaustion weighing her down like a physical burden. He sat across from her, cleaning his long hunting knife with a strip of leather, his movements precise and deliberate. She watched his hands, strong and calloused, capable of such intricate work, capable of what else? She closed her eyes, feigning sleep, though her mind raced. When she dared to open them again, he had laid out a thick wool blanket not far from the fire, then retreated to the base of a large pine, settling himself against its trunk with his rifle across his lap. He was giving her the better spot, the warmth of the fire. A small, unexpected gesture. It meant little, perhaps. Or perhaps it meant everything. They reached the cabin late the next afternoon. It was small, sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing on a mountainside, surrounded by towering pines and aspens. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a surprisingly welcoming sight. It was utterly isolated. The silence here was different from the stifling silence of Purgatory Flat or the tense silence of their journey. Here, it was a living thing, filled with the whisper of wind through the trees, the chatter of unseen creatures, the distant roar of a waterfall. Caleb unburdened the mule, then pushed open the cabin door. The interior was Spartan but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough wooden table and two stools its main furniture. A narrow cot was built into one corner, a pile of furs in another. There was a shelf with a few battered books and tin plates. He gestured towards the pile of furs. "There," he said, his voice raspy. It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her since the auction. Ilara understood his meaning. That was to be her bed. He set about lighting the fire in the hearth, his movements efficient. She stood uncertainly by the door, clutching her burlap sack, feeling like an intruder, a stray. What was expected of her? She didn't know the rules of this new, silent world. He glanced at her, then pointed to a bucket by the door and then to a well-worn path leading away from the cabin. Water. He needed water. It was a task, something she understood. Gratefully, she picked up the bucket and headed out, the cool air a balm on her face. The path led to a small, clear spring bubbling from beneath mossy rocks. As she filled the bucket, the cold water seeping over her dirty hands, she looked back at the cabin. It was a mere speck against the vast wilderness. She was alone with a stranger, a man who had bought her like a piece of livestock. Yet, he hadn't harmed her, hadn't even touched her beyond the impersonal transaction. He had shared his food, given her the warmer place to sleep. It was a confusing sort of kindness, if kindness it was at all. She carried the heavy bucket back, her arms straining. He took it from her at the door without a word, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a strange shiver through her. He poured some water into a pot and hung it over the fire. Soon, the smell of brewing coffee, real coffee, not the chicory swill she was used to, filled the small space. He handed her a steaming tin cup. She took it, her fingers warming around its heat. He had his own, leaning against the rough-hewn mantelpiece, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, but it was less an absence, more a presence, a heavy blanket settling over them. She sipped the coffee. It was strong, bitter, but good. She watched him. His profile was stark in the firelight, his jaw tight, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames, but seeing something far beyond them. Grief, she thought. She had seen that look in the eyes of war widows, in the hollow faces of those who had lost children to fever. This lonely hunter carried a sorrow as vast as the wilderness he called home. And somehow, that made him a little less terrifying. Days bled into weeks, each one a near-identical pattern of shared tasks and profound silence. Caleb rose before dawn, the soft sounds of him stoking the fire or checking his traps often the first Elara would perceive. He would hunt or work his trap lines, sometimes gone for the entire day, returning at dusk with game, a rabbit, a brace of grouse, sometimes even a deer slung over his shoulder. Elara, after her initial fear began to subside into a cautious watchfulness, started to find her own rhythms. She kept the cabin clean, a small act of assertion in the otherwise overwhelming newness. She learned to mend his rough-spun clothes, her stitches neat and tiny, a skill her own mother had taught her before illness took her, long before Martha's arrival. She gathered firewood, her arms growing stronger. She learned where the wild berries grew, supplementing their meager diet with tart, sweet fruit. She never spoke. He rarely did. Communication was a language of gestures, of objects laid out, of tasks anticipated and done. If he needed the axe sharpened, he would leave it by the whetstone. If he wanted stew for the evening meal, the pot would be left on the hearth. She learned to read the set of his shoulders, the slight furrow in his brow, the almost imperceptible nod that meant approval, or at least, acceptance. He, in turn, seemed to observe her with a quiet intensity. He noticed how she always faced him when he made a gesture, how her eyes scanned his lips, though he knew it was futile. He left a small cake of lye soap by the spring one morning, she found it, and that evening, her hair, washed and combed with her fingers, shone faintly in the firelight, the color of ripe wheat. He said nothing, but he looked at her for a fraction longer than usual. One afternoon, while Caleb was away, Elara explored a little further than usual, drawn by the sound of rushing water. She found the waterfall he'd mentioned, a cascade of silver tumbling down a sheer rock face into a deep, clear pool. The air was cool and misty here, ferns growing lush and green in the spray. She sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock, trailing her fingers in the water. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a small measure of peace settled in her heart. This place, wild and untamed, was also beautiful. It didn't judge her. It simply was. Returning to the cabin, she found Caleb had returned early. He was sitting at the table, a small, intricately carved wooden bird in his calloused hands. It was worn smooth with handling, its painted eyes faded. He looked up as she entered, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not the stoic hunter but a man laid bare, his eyes filled with a desolation so profound it made her ache. He quickly closed his hand around the bird, his expression shuttering back into its familiar impassivity. But she had seen. Somehow, she had known there was a deep well of sorrow behind his silence. She didn't acknowledge it, just went about her evening tasks, fetching water, preparing the rabbit he'd brought. But the image of his face, open and wounded, stayed with her. That night, a storm broke. It came suddenly, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the small cabin, making the timbers groan. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that vibrated through the very floorboards. Ilara, despite her pretense of deafness, had always been terrified of storms. The loud, unpredictable violence of them mirrored the chaos she had endured for so long. She huddled in her pile of furs, trying to control her trembling, pressing her hands over her ears as if that could block out the turmoil, both outside and within. Caleb sat by the fire, seemingly unperturbed, cleaning his rifle. But she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze kept flicking to the rattling window shutter. The wind howled like a banshee, and a particularly violent gust ripped the shutter from its leather hinges, sending it clattering away into the darkness. Rain and wind immediately blasted into the cabin, dousing the edge of the fire and sending sparks flying. Caleb swore, a low, guttural sound, and jumped up to wrestle with the opening, trying to block it with a spare plank. Ilara, despite her fear, scrambled up. He needed help. She grabbed a thick hide and pushed it against the hole while he tried to wedge the plank. The wind tore at the hide, rain soaking her thin dress in an instant. They fought the storm together, side by side, their shoulders brushing, their breath misting in the sudden cold. Finally, they managed to secure the plank. They stood back, panting, soaked and shivering. The fire was sputtering, nearly out. Caleb moved to rebuild it, his movements less steady than usual. When he had it blazing again, casting dancing shadows on the walls, he turned. The storm still raged outside, but inside, a fragile calm had descended. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her face, her dress clung to her, and she was shivering uncontrollably. But her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, met his. He walked to his cot, took the heavy woolen blanket from it, and without a word, draped it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her cheek as he did so, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it seared through her. He then sat back down by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. After a long silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire, he spoke, his voice so low she almost didn't catch it, even with her strained hearing. "Sarah, my wife, and little Tom. They were caught in a blizzard, in the high pass. I wasn't there." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet each word was a hammer blow. Ilara sank down onto her furs, the heavy blanket a comforting weight. She didn't speak, couldn't. What could she say? But she understood. The wooden bird. The desolate eyes. The solitude. It all made a terrible kind of sense. She pulled the blanket tighter, the scent of him, of pine smoke and damp wool, clinging to it. The storm raged on, but something inside Ilara had stilled. She was no longer just a bored girl. She was a witness to his grief. And in that shared, silent space, a tiny, fragile seed of connection had taken root. The weeks that followed the storm were subtly different. The silence remained, but it was softer now, less brittle. Caleb still kept his distances, but Ilara noticed small changes. He started leaving a portion of his coffee for her in the pot in the mornings, not just handing her a cup. He carved a new, sturdier handle for the water bucket after seeing her struggle with the old one. He even, on a rare trip down to the lower settlements for necessities he couldn't fashion himself, returned with a small, cloth-bound packet. He left it on the table without comment. Inside, Ilara found 3 needles, a spool of dark thread, and a square of faded calico fabric, patterned with tiny, almost invisible flowers. It was a humble gift, yet it spoke volumes. She spent an evening carefully mending a tear in her burlap dress with the new thread, the calico saved for something special, she knew not what. Ilara, emboldened by a nascent hope, found a sunny patch of earth behind the cabin, protected from the worst of the winds. It was rocky and overgrown with weeds, but the soil beneath looked dark and rich. She began to clear it, using a sharpened piece of flat wood as a makeshift spade. Her hand soon blistered and sore. Caleb watched her efforts from a distance, his expression unreadable. He made no move to help, nor did he discourage her. When she had cleared a small square, she found a few forgotten, shriveled potatoes in the root cellar beneath the cabin. They were sprouting tiny eyes. With painstaking care, she cut them into pieces and planted them, whispering a silent prayer to the earth. It was a small act of defiance against the harshness of her life, a tiny assertion of her will to create, to nurture. The potatoes were a gamble, the season already turning. But the act of planting, of coaxing life from the unforgiving soil, filled her with a quiet satisfaction. One crisp autumn morning, Caleb was checking his snares deeper in the woods than usual. Ilara was by the spring, washing the few tin plates they owned. The air was still, the forest quiet except for the rustle of dry leaves underfoot and the chirping of a chickadee. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, a low, menacing growl. Ilara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She slowly turned. Not 20 yards away, emerging from a thicket of tangled rhododendrons, was a lean, grey wolf. Its eyes, yellow and intelligent, were fixed on her. Its lips were drawn back in a snarl, revealing sharp, white teeth. Fear, primal and cold, washed over Ilara. She was trapped, the spring at her back, the wolf before her. She knew she couldn't outrun it. She dropped the plate she was holding, it clattered loudly on the stones. The wolf tensed, its growl deepening. She remembered Caleb's rifle, always leaning by the cabin door. But the cabin was too far. She was alone. Then, she heard it, a sharp crack, a sound she knew Caleb made sometimes to scare off bears from his meat cache. It was a branch snapping, but deliberate. The wolf's head jerked up, its ears pricked. It looked past Ilara, towards the cabin. Another crack, louder this time. The wolf hesitated, its aggressive posture faltering. It let out a frustrated yelp, then, with a final, baleful glare at Ilara, it turned and melted back into the undergrowth as silently as it had appeared. Ilara sank to her knees, trembling violently, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She stayed there for a long time, until the shaking subsided. When she finally managed to stand, her legs were weak and unsteady. She gathered the plates, her hand still fumbling, and made her way back to the cabin. Caleb was there, mending a snowshoe, his back to the door. He didn't look up as she entered. He couldn't have seen the wolf from the cabin, not from that angle. He couldn't have made the sounds. Or could he? Had he been closer than she thought, watching over her? The thought sent a fresh wave of confusion through her. Had he saved her? And if so, why the pretense of not noticing her distress? Later that day, as dusk settled, she was tending her small, hopeful potato patch. The plants were struggling, yellowed by the encroaching cold, but a few stubborn green leaves still clung to life. Caleb approached, stopping a few feet away. He held out his hand. In his palm lay 3 small, smooth, dark seeds. "Pumpkin," he said, his voice quiet. "Plant them next spring." "They do well here." Ilara stared at the seeds, then up at his face. His eyes were watching her, a flicker of something unreadable in their grey depths. Pumpkin seeds. A promise of a future spring, of a harvest. It was more than just seeds, it was an acknowledgement of her efforts, an investment in her presence. She reached out and took them, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible, rusty from disuse. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him beyond that single, hushed yes, after the storm. Caleb's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He stared at her, not at her lips, but into her eyes, as if searching for something. He had heard her. The whisper was soft, yet clear enough. He didn't react with shock, or anger, or even surprise that registered outwardly. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The ground will need turning deep," he said, his voice even. Then he turned and walked back towards the cabin, leaving Elara standing by her small garden, the pumpkin seeds clutched tightly in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knew. He had known, or at least suspected, for some time. Her flinch when the plate clattered. The way she sometimes anticipated his needs before he gestured. Small things, inconsistencies a man who lived by observation would eventually piece together. The silence had been a shield for her, yes, but perhaps it had been a comfort for him too, a space unburdened by the complexities of speech, of expectations. Now, the shield was down, at least a little. And he hadn't recoiled. He had simply offered her seeds for the future. The revelation of Elara's hearing, or at least her ability to perceive and respond to spoken words, hung in the air between them, unspoken yet palpable. Caleb didn't press her, didn't question the years of silence. He seemed to accept it as another facet of the woman he had brought to his mountain. His interactions with her shifted subtly. He still used gestures often, out of habit perhaps, or because words still felt cumbersome to him. But sometimes, he would speak a short phrase, a quiet instruction or an observation about the weather, and he would watch her face, watch for the flicker of understanding in her eyes. Elara, for her part, remained largely quiet. Speech was a foreign country she had not visited in years, the paths were overgrown, the landmarks forgotten. But the fear that had kept her mute for so long was slowly receding, replaced by a tentative curiosity. She found herself listening more intently to the sounds of the forest, to the cadence of Caleb's rare words, relearning the music of language. Their quiet cohabitation was undisturbed for several more weeks. The autumn colors blazed across the mountainsides, then faded, giving way to the stark beauty of late fall. The air grew colder, the days shorter. They worked together to prepare for the winter, chopping and stacking firewood, reinforcing the cabin against the coming snows, smoking the last of the hunted meat. In these shared tasks, a comfortable rhythm developed, a partnership forged in necessity and mutual reliance. The potato plants in Elara's small garden withered with the first hard frost, and she dug up the meager harvest, a handful of small, knobbly tubers. It wasn't much, but Caleb praised their flavor when she roasted them in the embers of the fire, and his quiet approval warmed her more than the flames. The threat, when it came, arrived with the first spitting snow of the season. Elara was returning from the spring, a full bucket in each hand, her breath misting in the frigid air. As she neared the cabin, she saw two figures on horseback emerging from the tree line. Her heart sank. One was stout, florid-faced, with a self-important air she recognized, Sheriff Brody from Purgatory Flat. The other, slouched in his saddle with a mean, knowing smirk, was Jedediah Hicks, the burly man who had bid for her at the auction, his eyes lingering on her with an expression that made her skin crawl. Sheriff Brody caught sight of her and called out, his voice loud and officious. "Well now, if it ain't the little deaf mouse. Thorn in?" Before Elara could react, Caleb stepped out of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his stance relaxed but wary. His eyes, cold as the winter sky, assessed the newcomers. "Sheriff," he acknowledged with a curt nod. Hicks spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow near Elara's feet. "Heard you found your tongue, girlie," he sneered, his gaze insolent. "Or was that just another trick of yours?" Elara flinched, instinctively moving closer to the cabin, closer to Caleb. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat. "Now, Thorn, there's been some talk in town. About this girl. Martha Stokes claims you ain't been trotting at her right. Says you tricked her, that the girl ain't even deaf. Says you owe her more money for undamaged goods, as it were." Caleb's expression didn't change, but Elara saw his knuckles whiten around the rifle stock. "Martha Stokes got her $20. A fair price, agreed upon, fair for a deaf mute, maybe," Hicks interjected, his voice laced with malice. "But a girl who can hear, who can talk if she wants to, she's worth more. Especially one as promising as this 1 inch." He let his eyes trail slowly down Elara's form, a lewd insinuation in his gaze. Rage, cold and unfamiliar, surged through Elara. These men, with their assumptions, their possessiveness, their casual cruelty. Caleb took a slow step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. The girl is under my protection. She stays here. There's no more money to be had. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a man who preferred bluster to actual confrontation, especially with someone like Caleb Thorne, who had a reputation for being as unmovable as the mountains themselves. Now, Thorne, be reasonable. Martha's got rights. And folks are saying you're keeping this girl against her will. That ain't lawful. Ask her, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. All eyes turned to Ilara. She felt trapped, the focus of their predatory attention. Hicks's leer, Brody's officious stare, Caleb's intense, unreadable gaze. Her throat felt tight, the words she needed caught like burrs. Hicks laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She ain't gonna say nothing. Too scared. Or maybe she likes it up here with the hermit. Likes the quiet. He winked crudely. That was the spark. The insinuation that she was complicit in her own degradation, that her silence was weakness, or worse, preference. The memory of Martha's shrill voice, the jeers of the crowd, the suffocating weight of being less than human, it all coalesced into a single point of burning indignation. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and looked directly at Sheriff Brody, then at Hicks. Her voice, when it came, was low and trembled slightly, but it was clear, carrying in the crisp air. I am not deaf, she said, each word a stone dropped into a still pond. And I am not here against my will. This is my home. A stunned silence followed Ilara's declaration. Sheriff Brody's jaw dropped. Jedediah Hicks's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of disbelief, then anger. Caleb didn't move, but Ilara felt the subtle shift in his stance, a fractional easing of tension, as if a weight had been lifted. Well, I'll be, Brody finally stammered, recovering some of his composure. So, Martha wasn't entirely wrong. You can hear and speak, Ilara added, a newfound strength resonating in her tone. She had found her voice, not just the physical ability to make sounds, but the courage to use it, to claim her truth. Hicks's face contorted with fury. You lying little cheat. You played us all for fools. That hunter probably knew all along, paid a cheap price for good stock. He made a move as if to dismount, his hand reaching towards the pistol holstered at his hip. That's enough, Hicks, Caleb's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whip crack. His rifle was no longer held loosely, it was pointed steadily at Hicks's chest. This discussion is over. Ilara has made her choice. You will respect it. Hicks froze, his eyes darting from the rifle muzzle to Caleb's implacable face. He was a bully, not a fighter when the odds weren't overwhelmingly in his favor. Sheriff Brody, clearly unnerved by the sudden escalation, raised his hands placatingly. Now, Thorne, no need for that. If the girl says she's here willingly, and she ain't deaf, well, that changes things. Martha's complaint don't hold much water then. He shot a nervous glance at Hicks. We'll be on our way. No trouble here, Hicks grumbled, his eyes still burning with resentment, but he didn't dare challenge Caleb. He spat again, this time with more vehemence, then wrenched his horse's head around. Brody, eager to de-escalate, nodded curtly to Caleb. Thorne. He tipped his hat awkwardly towards Ilara, then followed Hicks, the two riders disappearing back into the snow-dusted trees. Ilara watched them go, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. She had spoken. She had stood her ground. Caleb lowered his rifle, the immediate threat gone. He turned to her, his expression unreadable as ever, yet she thought she saw a flicker of something akin to pride in the depths of his grey eyes. You did well, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The simple words of acknowledgement were like a balm to her frayed nerves. She let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I was afraid, she admitted, the words tumbling out. But I couldn't let them. They won't be back, Caleb stated with quiet certainty. Hicks is a coward. Brody follows the path of least resistance. He leaned his rifle against the cabin wall and looked at her, truly looked at her, with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You're home," you said. It wasn't a question, but a quiet affirmation of her words. Ilara met his gaze, a shy smile touching her lips. "Yes," she whispered. "My home." The first heavy snows of winter arrived that night, blanketing the mountains in a thick, pristine white. The world outside the cabin became hushed, muted, a landscape of stark beauty and profound stillness. Inside, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. Caleb was mending a trap, his large hands surprisingly deft. Ilara sat nearby, stitching a patch onto one of his old shirts with the thread he had bought her, the calico fabric still saved. The silence between them was different now, transformed. It was no longer a barrier, but a shared space, comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. Occasionally, one of them would speak, a comment about the snow, a question about a task, and the words, no longer startling, would weave themselves into the quiet fabric of their life. Later, as the wind howled outside, creating a symphony of winter sounds, Ilara found Caleb staring into the flames, the small, carved wooden bird resting on the mantelpiece beside him. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and gently picked up the bird, turning it over in her hands. "Sarah and Tom," she said softly, not a question, but a remembrance. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes shadowed. He nodded slowly. "She loved birds," he said, his voice thick with unshed emotion. "Tom, he was always trying to catch them." Never could. Ilara reached out, her fingers lightly touching his arm. "They would be happy you're not alone anymore," she whispered. Caleb looked at her then, a long, searching look. He saw not a bored girl, not a deaf mute, but Ilara, resilient, perceptive, and possessed of a quiet strength that mirrored the very mountains he loved. He saw the woman who had brought a spark of life back to his frozen heart, who had planted a garden in the barren soil of his grief. He slowly covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. The touch was warm, firm, a silent acknowledgement of a bond forged in hardship, understanding, and a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of seasons. The firelight danced, the storm raged outside, but within the small cabin, there was peace, and the promise of a shared future, word by word, touch by touch, in the heart of the wild. The hunter was no longer alone. The silent girl had found her voice, and her home. And in the quiet sanctuary they had built together, their spirits, once bound by shame and grief, were finally, irrevocably, free.